The first time I met Josephine Pierce, I was holding a 200-pound china cabinet above my head, like some sort of confused, deeply unathletic atlas, and I dropped it directly onto my own foot. In my defense, nobody tells you that help the new neighbor unload his truck might mean furniture built by people who apparently hated ankles. I heard the crack before I felt it, which is never a good sign. And I was still working out whether I'd broken something structurally important when a woman in muddy rubber boots came around the side of the moving truck holding a shovel like she'd just finished burying something and wasn't in the mood for follow-up questions. "That," she said, looking down at the cabinet now resting on my foot, did not sound like a cabinet-shaped noise. "My name is Nate Calloway. I'm 33 years old. I own a pair of steel-toed boots for exactly this reason. And I hadn't worn them that morning, because nobody warns you that helping a stranger move his furniture might involve amateur orthopedic surgery on a Saturday. I restore old houses for a living, the kind with good bones and wiring that wants to kill you, which is either an apt metaphor for my recent relationship history or just a coincidence I've decided to find funny instead of depressing. My dating life, for the past year and a half, had been quiet enough that my mother had started using the phrase, "when you're ready," the same way other people say, "bless you," reflexively and slightly too often. The man responsible for this particular humiliation was standing on his new porch, 60-something silver at the temples, watching me with the calm of someone who had clearly survived worse injuries than a foot. His name was Walt Pierce. 3 years earlier, I had nearly become his son-in-law. I should probably mention that part. Until 18 months ago, I'd been engaged to Walt's older daughter, Whitney. She ended things in a manner so composed, so reasonable, so entirely without raised voices, that it took me almost a month to understand I'd actually been dumped rather than, as she'd phrased it, standing in my kitchen with the expression of someone doing me a considerable favor, given some space to reflect. She had a gift for that, making the ending sound like it had been my idea all along. "You let me win every argument," she told me 3 days before she left. Not cruel, just certain, the way she said most things. I started wondering if you had any convictions of your own. I heard later, through the kind of second-hand social archaeology you do after a breakup, piecing together what people actually said about you at parties you weren't invited to anymore, that she told our mutual friends a slightly different version, that I'd checked out, that I'd stopped trying. A friend named Priya had cornered me at a bar 2 months after the engagement ended to tell me, with real sympathy in her voice, how sorry she was that things had gotten so cold between us. And I'd stood there holding a beer I no longer wanted, trying to figure out which of us she thought had gone cold, because it certainly hadn't been me. It's a strange thing, hearing your own supposed emotional failures described back to you by someone who wasn't there. I'd wanted to correct the record every time it came up, and eventually stopped trying, because correcting Whitney's version of events had a way of making you sound exactly as defensive as she'd already told everyone you'd be. It was a closed loop. Any protest confirmed the story. I threw myself into the restoration business instead, which is a healthier coping mechanism than most, if considerably less lucrative than people assume. I'd started the company with Marcus 6 years earlier, the two of us fixing up a single crumbling Victorian on a bet. And we'd built a reputation since then for being the guys who wouldn't cut corners on load-bearing walls even when a client begged. It kept my hands busy and my calendar full enough that nobody at family dinners had reason to ask about my love life for longer than a polite sentence or two. I told myself that was a fine way to live. Mostly, I believed it. That was Whitney's actual talent. Not cruelty, narrative control. She could end something and somehow still be the reasonable one standing in the wreckage. I'd spent a long time turning her line over in my head, long enough to still be turning it over the morning. Walt Pierce moved in next door to my house in Golden, Colorado, and I found out secondhand, through a very heavy cabinet, that the universe apparently thought this was an excellent use of my weekend. "You're going to want ice," the woman with the shovel said. "And possibly a lawyer if my dad tries to make you carry the piano too." "There's a piano. There is absolutely a piano." I looked at Walt. Walt looked back at me with the mild, unreadable expression of a man who had once watched me get down on one knee for his daughter and had, as far as I could tell, no intention of ever bringing it up. "Nate," he said, introducing two facts to each other. "This is my daughter, Jo." Not Whitney, a name I'd never heard, attached to a face I'd genuinely never seen before, which should have been statistically impossible given how many holidays I'd spent at that family's table. "Younger daughter," Jo said, reading my confusion with more accuracy than I liked. "I was doing a master's in Edinburgh the entire time you two were together. Missed the wedding that didn't happen. Missed all of it, really." She said it lightly, the way you report weather. But there was something careful underneath, like she'd rehearsed saying her sister's failed engagement out loud without flinching and had only mostly succeeded. "Lucky you," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. She had dirt on both knees and a pencil tucked behind one ear that looked like it had survived a long professional relationship with her teeth. And when she smiled, the whole left side of her face got involved, like it physically couldn't help itself. I notice these things the way you notice weather turning. Not because you're looking for it, but because your body clocks it before your brain has agreed to. Sure, I wasn't blind or dead, but she was my ex-fiance's sister. And there is a rule about that somewhere. Probably older than fire. Over the next couple of weeks, I learned the rest of it without asking. The way you learn things about neighbors, whether you want to or not. Walt and Whitney's mother had split the year before, quietly, the way that whole family did everything, right down to the divorce. Walt had downsized into the little blue house next to mine, and Jo had come back from 3 years of landscape architecture work in Scotland to help him get settled before winter, which in Golden meant roughly 6 weeks before the first hard frost turned every unfinished outdoor project into a permanent one. She talked to plants. I want to be clear, this isn't a metaphor. I caught her more than once, crouched in the dirt with a trowel, having what sounded like a genuinely stern conversation with a rose bush that wasn't cooperating. She wore the same flannel jacket regardless of temperature, sleeves shoved up past her elbows, and she crossed frozen grass barefoot in a way that made me want to hand her socks and also never mention it, because I strongly suspected she'd take it as a personal challenge. She sketched garden beds on graph paper with that same battered pencil, humming under her breath, always slightly off-key, always the same 3 notes of some song she never finished. When something delighted her, she didn't just smile. Her shoulders came up around her ears like she was trying to physically contain the reaction, and mostly failing. One afternoon, I found her sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at a patch of dirt like it had personally offended her. "Problem?" I asked. "Bulbs. You're supposed to plant them before the ground hardens, and I've been back 3 weeks and apparently completely forgotten how November works." She didn't look up. Also, my dad's dog ate one, which I'm told is toxic, which means I now have to watch a golden retriever for signs of tulip poisoning, which is not a sentence I ever expected to say out loud. Is the dog okay? The dog is thriving. The dog does not deserve to be thriving. I laughed before I could stop myself. And she looked up at that, surprised, like she hadn't expected to land it. It was the first time I noticed how she watched people's reactions closely. Not anxiously, just carefully. The way you'd watch a structure to see if it was actually sound before you trusted your weight to it. You left Scotland for this, I said. Toxic dogs and frozen bulbs. I left Scotland because my dad needed someone around who wasn't emotionally exhausted by my sister's version of events, she said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded, and added, quieter. And because I ended something there myself. An engagement, actually. Different reasons than yours, probably. But I understand a little bit about showing up to Thanksgiving with a story everyone thinks they already know. I hadn't expected that. It recalibrated something in how I saw her. Not a woman who'd simply been away and unbothered, but someone carrying her own version of exactly what I was carrying, which made her presence next door feel less like a coincidence and more like two wrecked ships washing up on the same stretch of beach. A week after that, I watched her stand up for me without knowing I was listening. Mrs. Hollis from 2 doors down cornered her at the mailbox and started in on the usual street gossip. Something about how convenient it must be. Whitney's own sister moving in right next to the man Whitney left. Wasn't that a little strange? Jo didn't flinch. What's strange, she said, is spending your Tuesday morning speculating about a man who fixed his own foot after a stranger's cabinet fell on it and didn't even complain about the mail schedule getting delayed. He seems like the least strange person on this street, honestly. Mrs. Hollis didn't have a response to that. Neither did I, watching from my porch, coffee going cold in my hand. Later that same week, I watched her try and fail to teach Walt's retriever not to steal garden gloves directly off her hands while she worked, a battle she was clearly losing with good humor. He's not stupid, she told the dog, holding up a glove like evidence in a trial. He's spiteful. There's a difference. The dog, unmoved, trotted off with the glove anyway, and she threw both hands up like she'd expected exactly this outcome and simply needed it confirmed. I laughed loud enough that she turned, caught me watching from my own yard, and instead of looking embarrassed, just said, "You're witnessing a very real professional failure, you know." Like she'd decided there was no point pretending otherwise with me. I noticed, too, the smaller things nobody had asked me to notice. That she drank her coffee black, except on the coldest mornings, when she'd add too much cream and complain about it the entire time. That she left every gate she passed through open exactly 1 inch. Out of some landscaper's habit, I never asked her to explain that when she was deep in a sketch, she chewed the end of that same pencil. Without seeming to register, she was doing it, and I'd started, against my own better judgment, keeping a mental tally of every time it happened. I did not act on any of this. There were, as I've mentioned, rules. The rule got tested properly the 2nd week of October, when Walt caught me checking my mail and asked, in the tone of a man who'd clearly rehearsed the question, whether I did porches. "I do porches," I said. "I do most things with joists in them." "Good. Mine's rotting through, and I've got people coming for Thanksgiving." "Whitney's coming?" he added, watching my face carefully when he said it, the way you watch a patient's reaction to a diagnosis. "Whole family. I'd like the porch to hold weight by then." I ran through the reasons not to say yes with the thoroughness of a man building a case for a jury that didn't exist. My ex-fiancée would be standing on whatever I built 4 weeks from now, evaluating it the way she evaluated everything. Her father was, undeniably, watching to see how I'd handle the request, possibly as some kind of test I hadn't agreed to take. Taking the job meant admitting, at least to myself, that I was willing to spend a month of evenings 12 feet from a woman I had absolutely no business wanting to spend evenings near. And there was the matter of pride, too. Low and stubborn. Some part of me that didn't want Whitney's family to think the breakup had left me unable to function around them. Even though function around them and rebuild a porch while falling for the wrong daughter were not, strictly speaking, the same skill. None of that mattered in the end. The job would put me 12 feet from Joe Pierce most evenings for most of a month, which was either the best or worst use of my remaining self-control I could imagine. "I can start Thursday," I said. I told myself it was professional courtesy. I have since revised that story considerably. Joe was in the yard nearly every one of those evenings, because the porch backed directly into the garden beds she was redesigning, and there is apparently no version of restoring a Colorado backyard in October that doesn't involve two people working 12 feet apart for hours while pretending, with increasing difficulty, not to notice each other. The first evening, she brought me a coffee I hadn't asked for and set it on the sawhorse without comment. Like this was simply what evenings were now. "You measured that beam 3 times, she said, watching from the fence line, arms crossed against the cold. Wood doesn't forgive guessing. Neither do gardens. And yet here we both are, guessing. I'm not guessing. I'm being thorough. You're stalling, she said, because my dad's inside, and you're worried he's going to come out and ask you something you don't want to answer." She wasn't wrong. I measured the beam a 4th time anyway, mostly to have something to do with my hands that wasn't noticing the particular way she stood with her weight on one hip when she was needling someone. By the second evening, the coffee had become a fact of my life, and so had the rhythm of her voice when she was teasing me, which I'd started listening for the way you listen for weather turning. "Your level's older than me," she said, nodding at the scarred brass tool in my hand, my father's, his initials carved crookedly into the side, the bubble slightly yellowed with age. "Older than both of us, probably. My dad gave it to me. Told me a level doesn't lie to you, even when you want it to." Sounds like a metaphor. It's a tool. "Everything's a metaphor if you're avoiding a conversation hard enough," she said, and went back to her rosebush before I could decide whether to laugh or panic. I laughed internally and panicked slightly. Both were usually true that week at the same time. That Saturday, a hardware run turned into an accidental outing when Walt discovered, halfway through building a raised garden bed, that we were 3 brackets short and Joe was out of the paving stones she needed for the front path. We drove together in my truck because it made more sense than taking 2 vehicles. And somewhere between the tool aisle and the checkout, an unspoken agreement formed that this counted as normal, unremarkable 2 neighbors running errands behavior. Even though neither of us commented on how naturally she'd climbed into the passenger seat like she'd done it 100 times before. She held up 2 identical-looking gray pavers. "Tell me the truth. Does it matter which one I pick?" Not even slightly. "Then why does the guy in the orange vest look at me like I'm about to make the wrong choice?" "Because you've been standing here for 4 minutes, deliberating between 2 rocks that are, structurally speaking, the same rock. They have different names on the label. One of them is called Ashford Gray. The other is Weathered Slate. They are the same rock, Joe. This is exactly the kind of thing that ruins friendships," she said, and put both in the cart. which I decided not to argue with. On the way back, the sky did the thing Colorado skies do in October, going from clear to furious in about 11 minutes. And we made it exactly halfway across the parking lot before the rain hit sideways. I didn't think about it, just shrugged my jacket off and held it over both our heads, which put us close enough that her shoulder fit under my arm like it had been measured for the spot. And for the length of a sprint across wet asphalt, I forgot entirely that I was supposed to be keeping any kind of distance at all. We got in the truck soaked anyway, laughing too hard to talk for a full minute, her hair plastered flat on one side, and when she reached over to turn up the heat, her cold fingers brushed the back of my hand on the gear shift, and neither of us moved away first. "Your dad is going to ask why we're both wet," I said. "My dad is going to pretend he didn't notice, which is somehow worse." She wasn't wrong. By the third evening, our conversations had developed an actual shape. Less small talk, more something with real edges to it. She asked about the restoration work, and they were real questions. The kind that meant she'd actually been thinking about the answers rather than just filling silence. I asked about Scotland, why she'd really left, whether the rain was as bad as everyone claimed. "It rains exactly as much as everyone claims," she said. Then quieter. "I know what Whitney told people about why you two ended. About what you supposedly did or didn't do. You don't have to. I do, actually, because I think you might still believe some of it." She stood, wiping dirt onto her jeans instead of the towel hanging 6 inches away, which I'd already learned was simply how she operated. From where I was standing, which, granted, was an ocean away, it never sounded like the story of a man with no convictions. It sounded like the story of a man who kept trying to be fair to someone who didn't actually want fairness. She wanted a fight. You kept handing her peace instead, and she never forgave you for it. I didn't have a joke ready for that. It's rare, and it unsettles me every time it happens. "That's a generous read," I said. "I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate. There's a difference, even if you're not used to hearing it applied to you." She didn't say much more about her own engagement that night. But a few days later, the fourth evening technically, though I'd stopped keeping careful count by then, she told me the rest of it unprompted, sitting on an overturned bucket while I finished the last few balusters. "He wanted me to stop taking foreign contracts," she said, not looking up from the garden bed she was weeding with more force than the weeds strictly required. Said a wife who was gone 8 months a year wasn't really a wife. I thought about it for exactly 4 days, and then I gave the ring back, because I'd worked too hard building something of my own to hand it over just because someone found my career inconvenient to his life plans. That sounds like the harder choice. It was the only choice, once I actually let myself see it clearly. Everyone told me I was throwing away something good. Nobody asked whether it was good for me specifically or just good on paper. She finally looked up. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I don't want you thinking I'm someone who runs from complicated things. I'm someone who's already run toward one complicated thing and gotten burned. And I'd still make the same choice again tomorrow." It was, without question, the single most attractive sentence anyone had said to me in 18 months. And I told her so badly, in roughly those words, which made her laugh hard enough that she had to sit back down on the bucket she'd half risen from. We were standing closer than the conversation strictly required by then. Close enough that I caught the smell of cedar and turned earth on her jacket. Close enough that when a piece of hair came loose and fell across her face, I had the genuinely unhelpful thought that I would like to be the one to fix that, and immediately filed it under reasons I should go home now. Joe. I said it like a warning, mostly to myself. You're my ex's sister. I'm aware. I was there for at least 40% of the trauma, secondhand, via international phone calls I didn't ask for. That's not... I exhaled. There's a line. You know exactly where the line is. I know precisely where the line is, she said, not moving. I've been standing 3 feet behind it since Tuesday. That was the closest either of us had come to saying it plainly, and it did something to the air between us the October cold couldn't touch. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, quick, barely there, gone before I could be sure I hadn't imagined it, and something in my chest went very still. The particular stillness of a house right before a wall comes down. I don't know which one of us moved first. I know that by the time my hand found the porch rail beside her instead of finding her, we were close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her jaw. Close enough that neither of us was talking about levels or roses anymore. Close enough that when her fingers found the edge of my sleeve, just barely. Both of us went completely still, like touching a live wire we'd been warned about and reached for anyway. That was, naturally, the exact moment Walt's voice came booming out the back door, asking if either of us wanted pie, and we broke apart with the specific velocity of 2 people who had absolutely not been doing anything wrong and were nonetheless acting like it. Pie, Joe said, a little breathless, straightening a jacket that hadn't actually moved. Great, love pie. Never been more excited about pie in my life, I agreed, and went back to a beam I had already measured 4 times, my hands not quite steady on the level. Marcus, my business partner, noticed before either of us said a word to anyone. He caught me the following Monday, standing on a job site 3 blocks away, staring at a tape measure like it had personally wronged me. You've been holding that thing for 2 full minutes, he said. You measuring something or having a moment? I'm working. You're mooning. There's a difference. I've seen you work, and it doesn't usually involve staring at a number until it becomes a metaphor. He crossed his arms, unimpressed, the way 6 years of business partnership had entitled him to be. This is about the neighbor, the one with the shovel. It's about the tape measure. Man. He shook his head slowly, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he found personally disappointing. Water your own garden, which became something we said to each other for years afterward, always at the worst possible moment. That evening, back at the porch, she needed a second pair of hands to set a trellis against the fence line before the ground froze solid. And I held the base steady while she climbed a short ladder to anchor the top, which put her knee briefly against my shoulder and her hand flat against the crown of my head for balance, fingers spread like she was checking a roof for leaks. You're surprisingly sturdy, she said from somewhere above me. I get that a lot, usually about my walls, not my skull. I meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I adjusted my grip on the ladder as she leaned to drive in a screw, close enough now that I caught, under the cedar and turned earth, something warmer. Coffee, maybe. Or just her skin in the cold. You're going to fall on me, you know. I have excellent balance. You have a chewed pencil behind your ear and mud on both knees. Your balance is a rumor. She laughed, and the whole ladder shook with it. And for one unsteady second, her free hand landed on my shoulder to catch herself, fingers curling briefly into my jacket before she found her footing again. And neither of us mentioned how long the hand stayed there after the danger had passed. By the 4th evening, the porch railing was nearly finished, and so, apparently, was my ability to pretend this was simply a professional arrangement. Joe brought no coffee that night. She brought a question instead, sitting on the porch steps while I set the last of the balusters, knees pulled up to her chest, chin resting on them in a way that made her look 19 and entirely unbothered by cold that was clearly bothering her. "Do you still think about her?" she asked. Not accusing, just asking the way you ask about whether you're genuinely curious about. I thought about lying. I've never been especially good at it, which Whitney had found frustrating and which I was starting to suspect Joe would find the opposite of frustrating. "Sometimes," I said. "Less than I think you're asking about. More than I'd like." That's a very careful answer. I'm a careful man. It's been pointed out to me unfavorably before. I don't find it unfavorable. She was quiet a second, picking at a splinter on the step. "Do you think this is a bad idea? Whatever this is." There it was. The actual question. The one we'd been circling across 4 evenings of coffee and beams and roses, and I had roughly 11 honest answers queued up, and no idea which one wouldn't detonate something neither of us was ready to have detonated on a Thursday. "Ask me tomorrow," I said. She looked at me a long moment, long enough that I felt it land somewhere behind my sternum, and then nodded slowly, like she'd decided to allow the deferral, but only the once. "Okay," she said. "Tomorrow." I did not sleep well. I lay awake, running through 11 honest answers, and discarding all of them for being either too much or not nearly enough. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I gave up entirely and just stared at the ceiling, doing the math on how a china cabinet, a spirit level, and a woman who argued with roses had somehow become the center of my entire week. She showed up the next morning before I'd finished my first coffee, standing on my actual porch this time, not her father's, holding 2 mugs and wearing the same flannel jacket, sleeves shoved up despite cold that had turned the grass silver overnight. "It's tomorrow," she said. "You said ask you tomorrow." I stood there holding my own mug, watching steam curl off 2 cups neither of us had touched, and understood that whatever I said next was going to be the truest sentence I'd spoken in 18 months. "I think about you a lot more than I think about her," I said. "I think it started somewhere around the china cabinet, which I recognize is an insane place to fall for someone. But I've never claimed to be smooth about this kind of thing." Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe? Or the specific fear that comes with relief. "I liked you before I let myself admit it," she said. Which, for the record, was around the 2nd evening, when you measured that beam a 4th time just to avoid talking to me, and I thought, oh no. Oh, absolutely not. Not him. High praise. "I'm aware this is complicated. I've been aware the entire time. I'm aware I've wanted to kiss you since somewhere around the pie interruption," I said, "which is a timeline I would like on the record as longer than is convenient for both of us." That's a very long time to hold a coffee mug and say nothing. I'm a patient man. It's been pointed out to me unfavorably before. "I'm starting to like everything that's ever been pointed out to you unfavorably," she said. And something in her voice had gone quiet and certain in a way that undid me faster than anything else she'd said all week. She set her mug down on the railing without looking away from me. And there was no interruption this time, no pie, no Walt. Nothing but frost cracking under our boots and the particular quiet of a morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. When she kissed me, it tasted like coffee neither of us had drunk yet, and something warmer underneath that. And her hand found the collar of my jacket like she needed something to hold on to. And I made a sound I had no plans of repeating to anyone. And for one entire, uninterrupted minute, neither of us thought about anyone else's version of this story at all. Thanksgiving arrived with the finished porch and, unfortunately, with Whitney. The morning of, the house smelled like sage and burnt sugar, and Walt had put me to work carrying folding chairs from the garage with the specific bossiness of a man who decided, without discussion, that I was now on the family payroll for manual labor indefinitely. Jo was elbow-deep in a sweet potato dish she kept insisting she didn't need help with, humming her usual off-key 3 notes, occasionally swatting my hand away from the marshmallows on top with a wooden spoon like I was a raccoon she'd caught mid-heist. It felt, for about 2 hours, like an entirely ordinary holiday. The kind where nothing was complicated and nobody's ex-fiancé was due to arrive within the hour. I hadn't accounted for her actually showing up. Walt had mentioned it weeks earlier the way you mentioned distant weather. And somewhere in the fog of beams and coffee and one very good, very inconvenient kiss, I'd let myself believe the forecast might quietly change on its own. It didn't. She arrived early, in the deliberate, camera-ready way she did most things, and found Jo and me in the kitchen exactly 4 minutes after I'd let my hand rest, briefly, at the small of Jo's back while she reached for a serving dish. "Well," Whitney said from the doorway, in a voice pitched for an audience that wasn't quite there yet. "This is unexpected." Whit. Jo's spine went very straight. "We were just—" "You don't have to explain it to me." Whitney smiled, the same composed, reasonable smile she'd worn the day she left me, the one that made whatever came next sound like someone else's fault. "I just didn't realize you'd moved on to recycling, Nate. Efficient of you." "That's not what this is," I said. "Isn't it?" She looked between the two of us, cataloging, the way she'd once cataloged the exact wording of a breakup, so it would sound like my idea. "I just think it's worth someone in this family being honest for once. Since apparently that's not something you're capable of on your own, Nate. You never once told me you had feelings for my sister." "I didn't have feelings for your sister 18 months ago," I said. "I'd never met your sister 18 months ago. You made sure of that." "That's not fair." "You let me win every argument," I said, quoting her own line back at her, watching it land. "I started wondering if you had any convictions of your own. You said that to me 3 days before you left. I've thought about it every day since, trying to figure out what conviction you actually wanted. I don't think it was mine. I think you just wanted someone to blame that wasn't you." The kitchen went very quiet. Walt appeared in the doorway behind Whitney, not saying anything, watching with the same careful stillness he'd watched me with the day of the cabinet. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," Whitney said, recalibrating, her voice softening into the register designed to sound like the reasonable one in any room. "I'm concerned about my sister getting hurt by someone who clearly still has feelings he hasn't processed." "Finish the sentence, Whit." Jo's voice, when it came, was quiet and entirely unshaken. "Someone who what?" Whitney didn't finish it. Instead, she tried a different angle, the one I recognized best, the one that had ended things in my kitchen 18 months ago. The voice that made whatever she wanted sound like generosity. "I just don't want anyone in this family getting hurt because 2 people rushed into something out of convenience. That's all I'm saying. As someone who cares." "You don't get to be the one who cares here," Jo said, still perfectly calm, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "You gave him up. You don't get an opinion on who picks him up afterward." Whitney looked to her father instead, waiting for the room to side with her the way rooms usually did. And for the first time in 3 years of knowing that family, I watched it not happen. "I think," Walt said slowly, "you should go check on the pie." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even unkind. It was simply a fact, delivered the way he delivered most things, and Whitney understood it exactly as intended. She left the kitchen without another word, and something in my chest that had been braced for a year and a half finally, quietly, let go. Walt caught my arm briefly on his way past, the closest he'd come to any physical gesture between us in 3 years of knowing him. "For what it's worth," he said, low enough that only I could hear it. "I always thought you were the reasonable one. Just didn't say so, because it wasn't my place." Then he went to go find the pie himself, leaving me standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt considerably larger than it had 5 minutes earlier. Joe found me on the porch afterward, in the cold, staring at a rail I'd built with my own hands and a level that didn't lie to me even when I wanted it to. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry at her," she said, coming to stand beside me. "I want to be clear about that. I'm doing this because I've never in my life been looked at the way you looked at me over that cabinet, and I'm not giving that up because it's inconvenient for anyone else's version of events. It's more than inconvenient. It's genuinely absurd. Everything good usually is, a little." She took my hand, deliberately, the way you take something you've decided to keep. "So, are we doing this? All of it. The complicated dinners, my sister's opinions, my dad watching us fall in love on his newly rebuilt porch like a landlord with a front row seat?" "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like all of it, actually, in a way that alarms me slightly." "Good," she said, "because I already told my dad. He said, and I quote, 'It's about time someone in this family picked the right one.'" 6 months later, the porch had survived one Colorado winter, and Joe had planted the rose bush she'd once lectured into cooperation directly beside it, where it bloomed, against all odds, by May. She still talked to it. I still pretended not to notice, and she still caught me every single time. We moved in together that spring, into my house, because hers still smelled faintly of her father's cigars, and mine had better light for her drafting table. She filled it with graph paper and half-finished garden sketches and a golden retriever that had, against all medical odds, survived the tulip bulb, and who now hated me specifically, for reasons neither of us has ever managed to explain to him. She still stole the blanket every single night, some diagonal, physics-defying maneuver that left me with a corner of it in my own cold feet. And she still hummed the same 3 unfinished notes while she worked, and I still hadn't figured out what song it was. Because every time I asked, she pretended not to hear me, which I'd come to understand was its own kind of answer. Some mornings, she left for a client's yard before I woke, and I'd find a mug of coffee already poured and cooling on the counter, set there like she'd known exactly how long I'd sleep, which she usually did. By that fall, Joe had redesigned 3 more backyards in the neighborhood, and I had rebuilt the fence Walt kept insisting needed replacing, mostly because it gave me an excuse to be in that yard, close enough to watch her work, close enough for her to hand me things and let her fingers linger on mine a half-second longer than the task required, which I'd stopped pretending not to notice months earlier. Whitney and I settled eventually into something like distant civility. Not friendship, not warmth, but the quiet truce of 2 people who'd finally stopped needing the other to be wrong. Marcus, for his part, never let the cabinet story die. He told it at our engagement party with details I'm fairly sure he invented, insisting he'd personally driven me to the emergency room, which he had not, and that I'd cried, which I categorically had not. Though Joe laughed hard enough at his version that I decided not to correct the record too aggressively. I proposed the following October, exactly 1 year after the cabinet, on that same porch, with my father's old level in my jacket pocket. because I'd wanted something steady in my hands, and it seemed fitting. I didn't get down on one knee with any particular grace. I've never claimed to be smooth about this. But I told her that she was the only person who had ever looked at my steadiness and called it a strength instead of a flaw, and that I intended to spend the rest of my life proving her right. She said yes before I'd finished the sentence, which she still brings up whenever I accuse her of being impatient about anything else. Years later, when people asked how we met, I told them the truth, that I dropped a cabinet on my foot, fell for the wrong sister's shovel-wielding intimidation tactics, and spent 5 evenings measuring a porch beam I absolutely did not need to measure 4 times, just to have an excuse to keep standing near her a little longer. She usually laughs at that part, every single time, like it's the first. So, what would you have done, standing on that porch, if the person you'd built a wall around turned out to be exactly the one worth tearing it down for? And have you ever realized, maybe too late, maybe just in time, that the person who truly saw you wasn't the one who had you first? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this one got you, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.